dumped his barren wife to marry a young model, unaware she was a multi-billionaire holding the family trust. For 12 years, Victoria Bennett had endured her husband's contempt, his cruel whispers about her empty womb, his wandering eyes that settled on younger flesh. But when Derek Bennett finally threw divorce papers across their marble kitchen counter, choosing the 23-year-old Instagram sensation Madison Price over his 41-year-old wife, he sealed his fate. He mocked her during the settlement proceedings, laughing at her worthless existence, while his lawyer demanded half of what he believed were modest assets. But Derek had no idea that the demure woman sitting across from him, the one he'd belittled for over a decade, controlled the Bennett family trust, a financial empire worth $8.3 billion that his grandfather had secretly transferred to her 7 years ago. He mocked her, unaware of her hidden real estate empire, the one she'd built in silence while he paraded his affairs through Manhattan's elite circles. The surprising truth made him lose his mind when the revelations emerged in open court, and what she did crushed him in ways that money alone could never repair. But how had a woman dismissed as a failure amassed such inconceivable wealth? What secrets had she buried behind her submissive smile? And when the truth finally detonated, destroying everything Derek had built, would revenge taste as sweet as Victoria had imagined during those long, lonely nights? The first crack in Derek Bennett's reality appeared on a Tuesday morning in Judge Patricia Morehouse's courtroom, but the foundation had been crumbling for years. Victoria Bennett sat with perfect posture in a cream Chanel suit, her auburn hair pulled into an elegant chignon, her hands folded calmly in her lap. But beneath that serene exterior, her mind catalogued every micro-expression on her soon-to-be ex-husband's face. Derek lounged in his chair with the confidence of a man who believed he'd already won, his arm casually draped across the back of Madison's seat. The young model wore a dress cut too low for court, her bleached hair cascading over bronzed shoulders, her lips curved in a smirk that made Victoria's stomach tighten, not with jealousy, but with anticipation. Mrs. Bennett, Derek's attorney, a shark-suited man named Gerald Hutchins, began with barely concealed condescension. "You've claimed in your filing that you require substantial alimony, but my client has been the primary breadwinner throughout your marriage, while you've contributed essentially nothing to the household income. Isn't that correct?" Victoria's attorney, Helen Zhao, started to object, but Victoria placed a gentle hand on Helen's arm, silencing her. "That's one perspective," Victoria said softly, her voice carrying the same measured tone she'd perfected over 12 years of marriage. But her eyes, those dark, emerald eyes that Derek had once called boring, held something new, something that made Gerald Hutchins shift uncomfortably. Derek leaned forward, his handsome face twisting into the expression Victoria knew so well, the one that said she was stupid, worthless, a burden he'd carried out of obligation. But today, that expression would become a photograph for the history books of his downfall. "Your Honor," Derek interrupted, his voice dripping with theatrical exasperation, "this woman hasn't worked a day in our entire marriage. She spent 12 years failing at the only job that mattered, giving me an heir. And now she wants to be rewarded for that failure? It's absurd." Madison giggled, the sound grating against the courtroom's oak panels. But Judge Morehouse's expression remained stone. "Mr. Bennett," the judge said coolly, "you'll address the court, not your wife. Continue, Mr. Hutchins." Gerald adjusted his tie, consulting his notes with the confidence of a man holding all the cards. But those cards were about to be revealed as worthless. "Mrs. Bennett, you've listed your occupation as homemaker on all tax documents for the past 12 years, but you're now claiming that you have significant assets separate from the marital estate. Can you explain this, discrepancy?" Victoria smiled, the expression so slight that Derek didn't even notice, but Helen did, and so did Judge Morehouse. "I'd be happy to," Victoria replied. "Shall we begin with the real estate portfolio, or would you prefer to start with the trust fund?" The change in the room's atmosphere was immediate, but Derek, confident in his ignorance, actually laughed. "What real estate portfolio?" he scoffed. "What trust fund?" "Your Honor, my wife is clearly confused. She's probably referring to the summer house in the Hamptons, which I purchased." "The property at 47 Dune Road?" Victoria interrupted gently, but her words carried the weight of bombs. "That's actually owned by Bennett Holdings, LLC, which is wholly owned by Prescott Ventures, which is a subsidiary of VB Capital. I purchased that property in 2019 for $12.3 million. You've been living in my house for 5 years, Derek." The color drained from Derek's face, but it was only the beginning. Helen Zhao opened her briefcase, withdrawing a document 3 inches thick, but she didn't hand it to the judge yet. First, she wanted everyone in the room to see Derek Bennett's world collapse in real time. "Your Honor," Helen began, her voice crisp and professional, "we'd like to submit into evidence the complete financial disclosure for Victoria Ann Bennett, née Prescott. But I feel obligated to warn the court that the documentation is extensive." Judge Morehouse raised an eyebrow, but her interest was clearly piqued. "How extensive, Ms. Zhao?" "The real estate portfolio alone consists of 247 properties across 15 states and 4 countries. But that's just the beginning." Derek shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, but his voice came out as a strangled whisper. "That's impossible. Victoria doesn't own anything. She can't even balance a checkbook." Victoria finally turned to look at her husband directly, and the expression on her face was something Derek had never seen before, not in 12 years of marriage, not in the 3 years they'd dated before that. But it was the look of a woman who'd been playing chess while her opponent struggled with checkers. "I couldn't balance our personal checkbook," Victoria corrected quietly, "but that was because I was too busy managing $8.3 billion in assets. It's difficult to focus on grocery receipts when you're restructuring a commercial real estate empire spanning 3 continents." The silence that followed was absolute, but it lasted only a heartbeat before Derek exploded. "This is insane. She's lying." "Your Honor, my wife has clearly suffered some kind of mental break." "Sit down, Mr. Bennett," Judge Morehouse commanded, her voice cutting through Derek's hysteria like a blade. But when he continued to stand, trembling with rage and confusion, 2 bailiffs moved toward him. Derek collapsed into his chair. Helen began distributing copies of the documentation, one for the judge, one for opposing counsel, but she saved a special copy for Derek himself, walking it over personally and placing it directly in his shaking hands. "This is a summary," Helen explained, her voice professionally neutral but her eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "The complete documentation is available digitally, of course, but the highlights are here. Page 3 details the real estate holdings. Page 17 covers the stock portfolio. Page 31 outlines the Bennett family trust, the one your grandfather established in 1952, Mr. Bennett. The one he transferred into your wife's sole control in 2018. Derek's hands trembled as he flipped through the pages, but his face transformed from confusion to recognition to horror as the truth crystallized. "No," he whispered, his voice cracking. "No, that's... Grandfather wouldn't... He promised me." Victoria watched her husband's breakdown with the same calm expression she'd maintained throughout the proceedings. But inside, she remembered the day Thomas Bennett had called her into his study, his weathered hands gripping hers with surprising strength for a man of 93. "Victoria," the old man had said, his voice heavy with regret, "I made a mistake with Derek. I gave him everything too easily, and it ruined him. But you have something he'll never understand. You have patience, vision, mercy, even when it's not deserved. The Bennett fortune has been in this family for 3 generations, but it needs someone who understands that wealth is a responsibility, not a trophy. She had tried to refuse, but Thomas had been insistent. "He's going to leave you," Thomas had said bluntly. "I see how he looks at you now that you can't give him children. He's my grandson, and I love him, but he's also a fool. When he leaves, I want you to be protected. More than that, I want you to be powerful. Promise me you'll take this trust and use it wisely. Promise me you'll make something of yourself that has nothing to do with being anyone's wife." She had promised, but she'd never imagined this moment. Gerald Hutchins was speed-reading through the documents, his face growing paler with each turned page, but when he reached page 31, he physically recoiled. "Your Honor," Gerald said weakly, "I need to request a recess. My client and I need to review these materials," and "Denied," Judge Morehouse said firmly, but her attention was fixed on the documents before her, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she absorbed the magnitude of what she was seeing. "Ms. Zhao, walk me through this. The Bennett Family Trust. This is the manufacturing and real estate fortune built by Thomas Bennett starting in the 1950s. "Correct, Your Honor, but the trust has been significantly expanded under Mrs. Bennett's management. When she assumed control in 2018, the trust was valued at approximately $2.1 billion, primarily in manufacturing assets and commercial real estate. Under her stewardship, the value has increased to $8.3 billion through strategic diversification, including significant investments in technology, sustainable energy, and international real estate development." Derek made a sound like a wounded animal, but no one paid him any attention. "And Mr. Bennett had no knowledge of this transfer?" Judge Morehouse asked, her tone suggesting she already knew the answer. "None whatsoever, Your Honor, but the transfer was completely legal and properly documented. Thomas Bennett was of sound mind. We have extensive medical and psychological evaluations to prove it. He had every legal right to transfer the trust to whomever he chose, and he chose his granddaughter-in-law." "Why?" Derek croaked, the single word torn from his throat. "Why would he do that to me?" Victoria finally spoke, her voice steady, but there was an undertone of something, not cruelty but truth delivered without softening. "Because he knew you, Derek, better than you know yourself. But he hoped you'd prove him wrong. He gave you 7 years from 2018 until his death last year to show him that you could be the man he wanted you to be. Instead, you spent those years having affairs, mocking me for my inability to conceive, and planning to leave me for a woman young enough to be your daughter." Madison shifted uncomfortably in her seat, but Derek's attention never wavered from Victoria. "You manipulated him," Derek hissed. "You poisoned him. Against me. You're a conniving, barren Mr. Bennett." Judge Morehouse's voice cracked like a whip. "One more outburst and you'll be held in contempt. Do you understand?" But Derek seemed beyond caring about legal consequences. His entire worldview was collapsing, and with it, his sanity. Helen continued, her voice cutting through Derek's heavy breathing. "Your Honor, we'd also like to submit evidence of Mr. Bennett's repeated adultery, including documented affairs with 7 different women over the past 5 years. But more relevant to this proceeding is evidence that Mr. Bennett has been systematically misrepresenting his own financial position." Gerald's head snapped up. "What?" "Mr. Bennett has claimed in his financial disclosure that his annual income from Bennett Industries is approximately $450,000, but our investigation reveals that he's actually been drawing $2.3 million annually from the company, money he's been funneling into offshore accounts and undisclosed investments. He's also taken out over $5 million in loans against his expected inheritance from the Bennett Family Trust." an inheritance that, as we've now established, doesn't exist. The remaining color drained from Derek's face, but this time it wasn't anger or confusion. It was fear. "You investigated me?" he whispered, his voice hollow. Victoria met his gaze, but her expression remained neutral. "I protected myself. There's a difference. But you made it necessary, Derek. Every cruel word, every affair, every time you told me I was worthless, all of it made me more determined to ensure you could never destroy me. So yes, I investigated, I documented, I prepared, because I knew this day would come." Gerald was frantically whispering with Derek, but Derek kept shaking his head, his movements becoming more erratic. But Madison, clever, self-interested Madison, was slowly edging her chair away from Derek, her Instagram-perfect face calculating new trajectories. Judge Morehouse removed her glasses, studying Victoria with undisguised fascination, but her voice remained professionally neutral. "Mrs. Bennett, I have to ask, why maintain the pretense? If you've had access to this kind of wealth for 7 years, why continue living as if you were financially dependent on your husband?" Victoria paused, considering her answer carefully. But when she spoke, her words carried the weight of years of careful planning. "Because, Your Honor, I wanted to give Derek every opportunity to be the man I'd married, the man I'd fallen in love with 15 years ago. But I also needed to know, with absolute certainty, who he truly was when he thought I had nothing, when he believed I was powerless, dependent, trapped. His treatment of me during those years answered every question I'd ever had. It showed me that the man I'd married existed only in my imagination." The courtroom was utterly silent, but the silence felt heavy, pregnant with implications that reached far beyond divorce proceedings. Derek suddenly lunged forward, grabbing the edge of the table as if it were the only thing keeping him upright, but his voice emerged as a desperate plea. "Victoria, please, we can fix this. I made mistakes, I know that, but we can start over. I'll end things with Madison. I'll go to counseling. I'll do whatever you want. But please, you can't take everything. That trust should have been mine. It was supposed to be mine." Victoria looked at the man she'd married, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time in years, but she didn't see the charming investment banker who'd swept her off her feet when she was 23. She saw a middle-aged man whose handsome face had been eroded by entitlement and cruelty, whose eyes held no depth beyond their own reflection. She saw a man who'd spent 12 years breaking her spirit, not because he was evil, but because her pain was inconvenient background noise to his pursuit of pleasure. "No, Derek," she said softly. "The trust was never yours. It was your grandfather's, and he entrusted it to me. But more than that, you can't take everything because you never had anything to begin with. Your job at Bennett Industries? I own the company. Your apartment in Manhattan. The building is owned by one of my LLCs. Your car, your club memberships, even the clothes you're wearing, all of it was purchased with money that ultimately came from assets I control. You've been living in my world for 7 years, but you were too arrogant to notice." The truth of her words hit Derek like a physical blow, but he rallied, his face twisting into the ugly mask Victoria had seen so many times in private. "You vindictive bitch," he snarled. "This is about revenge. You're punishing me because you're broken, because you couldn't give me children, because you're old and bitter and—" "Mr. Bennett!" Judge Morehouse stood, her face flushed with anger. "Bailiff, remove Mr. Bennett from my courtroom now." But before the bailiffs could move, Victoria raised her hand. "Your Honor, may I respond?" Judge Morehouse hesitated, but then she nodded, sitting back down slowly. Victoria turned to Derek, and when she spoke, her voice was steady but filled with years of suppressed pain. "I'm not broken, Derek. I'm infertile. There's a difference. But you never bothered to learn that difference. You never asked about the endometriosis that made every month agonizing. You never held me during the 3 miscarriages I suffered in our first 5 years of marriage. You never came to a single doctor's appointment or asked what you could do to make the pain easier. Instead, you made my medical condition about your disappointment, your wounded pride, your thwarted legacy. Derek opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. But Victoria wasn't finished. You want to know what this is about? It's not revenge, but it's also not forgiveness. This is about accountability. You made choices, Derek. You chose cruelty over compassion. You chose affairs over honesty. You chose a trophy over a partner. And now you get to live with the consequences of those choices. Helen placed a hand on Victoria's shoulder, a gesture of support, but also a gentle reminder that they'd accomplished what they came for. Judge Morehouse consulted her notes, her expression contemplative, but when she spoke, her words were decisive. Given the evidence presented, it's clear that this case is far more complex than initially represented, but the fundamental facts are not in dispute. Mrs. Bennet has substantial separate property acquired both before and during the marriage through inheritance and her own financial management. Mr. Bennet has no legitimate claim to those assets. Furthermore, Mr. Bennet's documented adultery and financial misrepresentation severely undermine his position. Gerald tried one last time. Your Honor, my client was unaware of... Your client's awareness is irrelevant to the legal facts. Judge Morehouse cut him off, but her tone suggested she'd heard enough. Here's my preliminary ruling. Subject to final documentation, Victoria Bennet retains all separate property, including the Bennet Family Trust and all associated assets. Derek Bennet receives no alimony. The marital assets, those few that actually exist as true marital property, will be divided equitably. But given Mr. Bennet's adultery and deception, I'm inclined toward a 70-30 split in Mrs. Bennet's favor. Derek made a choking sound, but it was Madison who spoke, her voice cutting through the tension with brutal pragmatism. Derek, honey, she said, her Valley Girl accent suddenly less pronounced. I think we need to talk about our engagement. The look of betrayal on Derek's face might have been comical if the situation weren't so devastating, but Victoria felt no joy in his pain, only a profound sense of relief that this chapter was finally closing. This isn't over, Derek said hoarsely, pointing a shaking finger at Victoria. I'll appeal. I'll fight this. You can't just... Mr. Bennet, Helen interrupted calmly, I should inform you that we've also prepared documentation for potential criminal charges related to your financial fraud and embezzlement from Bennet Industries. But Mrs. Bennet has thus far declined to press charges. However, should you choose to continue this fight, that decision may be revisited. Derek's finger slowly lowered, but his eyes remained fixed on Victoria, filled with a mixture of hatred, disbelief, and something that might have been grief. Court is adjourned, Judge Morehouse announced, her gavel striking with finality. Mr. Hutchins, I'll expect your client's formal acceptance of these terms within 48 hours. Otherwise, we proceed to full trial, and I assure you, the outcome will be significantly worse for Mr. Bennet. As the courtroom emptied, Victoria remained seated, her hands still folded calmly in her lap. But inside, she felt something shifting. Not triumph exactly, but a loosening of bonds she'd carried for so long that she'd forgotten what freedom felt like. Helen squeezed her shoulder. You okay? Victoria nodded slowly, but her eyes were distant, already moving beyond this moment. I need to make some calls. There's a women's shelter in Brooklyn that needs a new facility. And I've been in discussions with a fertility research foundation that's doing groundbreaking work on endometriosis treatment. It's time to stop hiding what I can do. Helen smiled. The world has no idea what's about to hit it, but Victoria shook her head. That's not the point. The point is helping people who are where I was, powerless, in pain, dismissed. Money is just a tool, but what you do with it determines whether you're building or destroying. 6 months later, Victoria stood in the ballroom of the Manhattan Cultural Center, surrounded by 500 of New York's most influential philanthropists, activists, and business leaders. But this time, she wasn't Derek Bennett's quiet wife, fading into the background of his networking events. She was Victoria Prescott Bennett, founder and CEO of the Prescott Foundation for Women's Health and Economic Empowerment. The foundation had made headlines for its first major initiative, a $500 million commitment to fertility research and treatment, with a focus on making cutting-edge reproductive health care accessible to women regardless of their economic status. But that was just the beginning. The foundation had also launched a venture capital fund specifically for women-owned businesses, a network of affordable housing developments in underserved communities, and a legal defense fund for women escaping abusive relationships. "You've built something extraordinary," Helen said, appearing at Victoria's elbow with 2 glasses of champagne. But Victoria noted that Helen's glass was sparkling cider, a concession to the pregnancy she'd announced 3 months earlier. "We've built something extraordinary," Victoria corrected. "None of this happens without you, Helen, but I'm grateful for what we're creating together." They clinked glasses, surveying the crowd. But Victoria's attention caught on a familiar figure near the entrance. Derek, looking diminished in an off-the-rack suit that hung awkwardly on his frame. He was with a woman Victoria didn't recognize, younger but not as young as Madison. His eyes scanned the room until they found Victoria, and for a moment their gazes locked. Helen followed Victoria's gaze. "Want me to have security remove him? He's not on the guest list." But Victoria shook her head. "Let him stay, but keep an eye on him." Derek made his way through the crowd, his path indirect but determined. But Victoria didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't show any of the old fear that his presence might once have triggered. "Victoria," Derek said when he finally reached her, his voice careful, stripped of its former arrogance. "Thank you for not having me thrown out. I know I don't deserve to be here, but I needed to see this, to see what you've done." Victoria studied him dispassionately. The man before her bore little resemblance to the one who'd sat across from her in that courtroom 6 months ago. But the changes weren't just physical, though he'd certainly aged, stress etching new lines around his eyes and mouth. It was something deeper, a fundamental diminishment of presence. "Why are you here, Derek?" He flinched at her directness, but he also seemed to have expected it. "I've been going to therapy 3 times a week, and I've been working a real job, not handed to me by family. I'm an analyst at a small investment firm. The pay is terrible, but the work is honest, and I've been trying to understand everything, how I became the person I was, how I treated you, why I couldn't see what was right in front of me." Victoria waited, not offering encouragement or condemnation, but her silence demanded that he continue. "I don't expect forgiveness," Derek said quickly. "I know I don't deserve it, but I wanted you to know that you were right about all of it. I was cruel, I was selfish. I turned your pain into my grievance and your strength into my convenience, and I'm sorry. Not because saying it changes anything, but because you deserved to hear it years ago, and I was too much of a coward to say it." The apology hung between them, inadequate but genuine. But Victoria felt no surge of emotion, no satisfaction, no renewed anger, no softening toward the man who'd made so much of her life miserable. "I appreciate you saying that, Derek, but I need you to understand something. This foundation, this work, my life now, none of it exists despite you. It doesn't exist because of you either. You were an obstacle I had to navigate, but you were never the story. You were never that important." The words were delivered without malice, but their impact was devastating. Derek's face crumpled, and for a moment Victoria thought he might cry. "I know," he whispered. "That's what I'm starting to understand. I spent our entire marriage believing I was the center of the universe, but I was just background noise in your life. Even when you loved me, even when you were trying to save our marriage, I was never as important as I thought I was." Victoria nodded slowly, but then, surprising herself, she reached out and briefly touched his arm. "Derek, I hope you find peace. I hope therapy helps. I hope you become someone you can be proud of. But you need to understand that your redemption isn't my responsibility. It never was. That's work you have to do for yourself, without any expectation of forgiveness or reconciliation from me." Derek nodded, tears now visible in his eyes. But he didn't try to prolong the conversation. He simply said, "Thank you for everything you didn't do to me. You could have destroyed me completely, but you didn't. That's more than I deserved." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd, but Helen appeared at Victoria's side, her expression questioning. "You okay?" Victoria considered the question, but her answer came easily. "I'm better than okay, but I'm also done with that chapter. Derek's journey is his own now. Mine continues here." She gestured to the room, to the assembled crowd of people who represented not wealth or status, but genuine commitment to making the world marginally less cruel. But her eyes settled on a small group near the stage. Women she'd met through the Foundation's support programs, women who'd overcome their own forms of powerlessness and pain. One of them, a young Latina woman named Carmen, caught Victoria's eye and waved enthusiastically. Carmen had fled an abusive relationship with nothing but her 2 children and a dream of becoming a nurse. But the Foundation's housing and education programs had given her a path forward. Now, 2 years later, she was months away from her RN license and had become a fierce advocate for other women in similar situations. "She wants to speak tonight," Helen said, following Victoria's gaze. "I told her she didn't have to, but she insisted. Says she wants people to understand what the Foundation really means, beyond the press releases." Victoria smiled, the expression genuine and unguarded, in a way it never could have been during her marriage. "Then let's make sure everyone's listening." The event concluded with Carmen's speech, raw, powerful, and utterly unfiltered. But as the crowd dispersed and Victoria finally returned to her penthouse apartment, purchased in her own name, decorated to her own taste, filled with silence that felt peaceful rather than oppressive, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. The journey from Thomas Bennett's study to this moment had been longer than 7 years, but it had really begun in those first awful months of her marriage, when she realized that the charming man she'd married viewed her primarily as a vessel for his children, and secondarily as an ornament for his life. It had continued through the miscarriages, the affairs, the casual cruelties delivered with a smile. But it had transformed the day Thomas had looked at her with understanding and offered her something Derek never could: power without conditions. She pulled out her phone, scrolling to a photo she'd saved, Thomas Bennett in his study, one of the last pictures taken before his death. But his eyes still held that sharp intelligence, that understanding of human nature that his grandson had never inherited. "Make me proud," he'd said as he signed the trust documents. "But more importantly, make yourself proud. Build something that matters. Use this gift to create space for others who've been made to feel small. That's the real measure of wealth. Not what you have, but what you enable others to become." She'd kept that promise, but more than that, she'd discovered that the power Thomas had given her was merely a tool to unlock the power she'd always possessed. The strength to endure hadn't come from the money, but the money had given her the space to recognize that strength, to cultivate it, to transform it into something that could lift others. Her phone buzzed, a text from Helen. Board meeting tomorrow at 9 a.m., but also you should see the donation numbers from tonight. 47 million committed. You're changing the world, Victoria. Hope you're ready for what comes next." Victoria smiled, typing her response. "Ready as I'll ever be. But honestly, I'm just getting started." She set down her phone and walked to her floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over Manhattan's glittering skyline. But she wasn't seeing the city as it was. She was seeing all the possibilities it represented. All the women like her, like Carmen, like countless others who'd been told they were worthless, broken failures. All the women who were discovering, or would discover, that their power had never come from anyone's approval or validation, but it had always been there, waiting to be recognized and claimed. Derek's final glimpse of her across that crowded ballroom would haunt him, she knew, but not because she'd been cruel or vengeful. Rather because she'd been something worse from the perspective of his ego, indifferent. He'd spent their entire marriage making her feel small, but in the end, he'd become the smaller person. Not through any action she'd taken, but through the revelation of who he'd always been when stripped of unearned advantages. The surprising truth that had made Derek lose his mind wasn't just the money, but it was the realization that while he'd been focused on diminishing her, she'd been quietly building an empire. While he'd been collecting conquests and nursing grievances, she'd been learning, growing, preparing, and what she'd done, not in revenge but in pursuit of her own purpose, had crushed him because it revealed how irrelevant he'd always been to her story. Victoria turned from the window, her reflection ghosted in the glass, but she saw not the woman Derek had mocked, nor even the billionaire the press now scrambled to profile. She saw simply herself, flawed, healing, still carrying scars that money couldn't erase, but also powerful, purposeful, and finally free. The Bennett Family Trust would continue to grow under her stewardship, but it would also pour out into the world, creating opportunities and safety nets and possibilities for people who'd been dismissed, overlooked, or actively harmed by systems designed to benefit people like Derek. That was Thomas's legacy, but it was also her own, crafted through years of silent observation and careful planning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new chances to build something meaningful. But tonight, Victoria allowed herself something she'd rarely permitted during her marriage: pride. Not in wealth or status or revenge, but in the simple act of survival transformed into service. She'd been called barren, worthless, broken, but she'd become something far more powerful than Derek could ever comprehend. She'd become free, and in that freedom, she'd found her purpose, but she'd also found herself, not as someone's wife, someone's disappointment, or someone's trophy. Just Victoria, standing in her own space, living her own life, building her own legacy. The city lights glittered below, each one representing a life, a story, a possible connection. But Victoria's story, the real one, not the tabloid version or the courtroom drama, was just beginning. And this time, she was writing it herself. 5 years after the divorce, Victoria stood in the conference room of Prescott Foundation headquarters, but the view from the 42nd floor had changed. The foundation had moved from its original offices into a building Victoria had commissioned specifically for their expanding work, a LEED-certified structure in downtown Manhattan, with affordable housing units on the lower floors and foundation offices above. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone, but it was the practical application of Victoria's philosophy. Wealth that lifted as it rose. The Endometriosis Research Initiative just published their breakthrough study, Dr. Sarah Okonkwo announced, pulling up the report on the screen. 3 new treatment protocols, all showing remarkable success rates. But more importantly, they've developed a diagnostic tool that reduces identification time from an average of 7 years to 6 months. Victoria felt her throat tighten, but she maintained her composure. 7 years. That's how long she'd suffered before doctors had finally taken her pain seriously. But now, because of research the foundation had funded, millions of women would be spared that particular torture. How soon before it's widely available? Helen asked. She was now the foundation's chief operating officer, her second child napping in the on-site daycare 3 floors below. FDA approval is expected within 18 months, but we've also established partnerships with healthcare providers in 43 countries. The goal is global accessibility within 5 years. The meeting continued, covering the foundation's expanded portfolio, a microfinance program that had helped 12,000 women start businesses, a legal advocacy network that had processed 8,700 cases, and a housing initiative that had created affordable homes for 3,400 families. But the numbers, impressive as they were, weren't what drove Victoria anymore. It was the stories behind them, the Carmens of the world who'd found pathways from survival to thriving. After the meeting concluded, Victoria remained in the conference room, gazing out at the city, but her reflection in the glass showed a woman transformed, not just by wealth or power, but by purpose. At 46, she wore her age without apology, her auburn hair now streaked with distinguished silver, her face lined with the evidence of laughter and hard-won wisdom. Her phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number, but the preview made her pause. "Victoria, this is Derek. I hope it's okay that I'm reaching out." She almost deleted it unread, but curiosity won out. "Victoria, this is Derek. I hope it's okay that I'm reaching out. I wanted you to know that I just celebrated 5 years sober. AA taught me that I need to make amends, but I also know you don't owe me your time or attention. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know that I've spent these 5 years trying to become someone different, someone better. I work with young men now talking about toxic masculinity and entitlement and how easy it is to destroy the people who love you. It doesn't erase what I did, but maybe it prevents some other man from making my mistakes. I hope you're well. I hope the foundation continues to change lives, and I hope you found happiness. You deserved it all along. Derek." Victoria read the message twice, but her emotional response was muted, not cold but distant, like reading about someone else's life. Derek's redemption arc, if genuine, was his own achievement. But it existed in a separate universe from hers, their paths having diverged so completely that intersection seemed impossible. She typed a brief response. "I'm glad you're finding your way, Derek. Sobriety is hard work, and helping others is meaningful. I wish you continued success in your recovery." Victoria. She didn't add more, but she also didn't need to. That chapter had closed so thoroughly that even rereading it felt unnecessary. Her phone rang, a video call from Carmen, whose contact photo showed her in nursing scrubs, grinning widely. "Victoria, did you see? I got the promotion. I'm the new head nurse in the pediatric ICU." Victoria's face split into a genuine smile, but her joy was unrestrained in a way it never could have been during her marriage. "Carmen, that's incredible. How are you celebrating?" "That's why I'm calling. We're having a dinner tomorrow night, all the women from the first cohort of the Foundation's program. We want you there, but only if you're comfortable. We know you're busy, but you changed our lives. We want to say thank you." Victoria's eyes stung with unexpected tears, but they weren't sad tears or bitter tears. They were the tears of someone who'd transformed her own pain into pathways for others, and who now got to witness the fruit of that transformation. "I'll be there," Victoria said firmly. "Text me the details. But Carmen, you changed your own life. I just opened a door. You're the one who walked through it." Carmen's eyes shimmered. "You opened the door, but you also taught us we were worth walking through it. That's the difference. Before the Foundation, I thought I deserved what happened to me. But you showed me I deserved better. all of us deserved better. After the call ended, Victoria sat in the quiet conference room, but the silence felt full rather than empty. She thought about the girl she'd been at 23, falling for Derek's charm and mistaking his confidence for substance. But she thought about the woman at 34 sitting in Thomas Bennett's study, terrified of the responsibility he was offering, but also sensing that it might be her salvation. And she thought about the woman at 41, sitting in that courtroom, finally claiming her power, not with cruelty, but with simple, devastating truth. But most of all, she thought about the woman she was now, still healing, still learning, but also building something that would outlast her lifetime. The foundation would continue long after she was gone, a living testament to the principle that suffering could be transformed into service, that power could be wielded with grace, and that the best revenge was becoming so fully yourself that your former tormentor became irrelevant to your story. Helen appeared in the doorway, but her expression was knowing. "You okay?" "I heard from Derek," Victoria said simply. 5 years sober, doing men's advocacy work. Says he's trying to be better. Helen studied her friend's face, but she saw no distress, no unresolved pain. "How do you feel about that?" Victoria considered the question carefully, but her answer came easily. "I feel nothing much, honestly. I hope he's sincere. I hope he helps people. But his journey is his own. It doesn't intersect with mine anymore." "That's healthy," Helen observed, "but also remarkable. Most people never get that kind of closure." "It's not closure," Victoria corrected gently. "Closure implies that his chapter needed to end for mine to begin. But the truth is, my real story started the day I stopped waiting for him to give me permission to be myself. Thomas gave me resources, but he also gave me something more important. He gave me belief that I was worth more than Derek's assessment of me. Everything else followed from that." Helen smiled, but she also pulled out her phone. "Speaking of which, you need to see this. It went up an hour ago." She showed Victoria a video, a young woman, maybe 25, speaking directly to camera with fierce intensity, but the title made Victoria's breath catch. "How the Prescott Foundation Saved My Life. A Thank You to Victoria Bennett." The woman in the video spoke about escaping domestic violence with her infant son, about living in a shelter, about the despair of believing she'd never be more than a victim. But then she described finding the foundation's housing program, the legal support, the job training, the community of women who'd survived similar trauma. She described rebuilding her life, reclaiming her education, and finally feeling safe. "So this is for Mrs. Bennett," the young woman concluded, tears streaming down her face. "You don't know me, we've never met, but you saved my life. Not just by providing resources, but by creating a system that treated me like I was worth saving. Like my trauma didn't define me. Like I deserved a future. So thank you. Thank you for turning your pain into our possibilities. Thank you for being proof that survival can become thriving. And thank you for showing women like me that we're not broken, we're warriors, and we deserve everything." The video had 2.3 million views and counting, but the comments section was flooded with similar stories, women sharing their own experiences with the foundation, with domestic violence, with being told they were worthless or broken or beyond help. Thousands of comments, but all of them variations on the same theme. "You helped me remember I was worth helping." Victoria watched the video 3 times, but each viewing hit her differently. The first time, she cried, but the second time, she felt profound gratitude. And the third time, she felt something unexpected, peace. Not the peace of completion, but the peace of knowing she was on the right path, doing work that mattered, living a life that aligned with her deepest values. 5 years ago, I was so angry, Victoria said quietly, not just at Derek, but at myself for wasting so much time trying to be what he wanted. But now I realize that those years weren't wasted. They taught me what matters. They showed me what I needed to build, and they gave me empathy for everyone who feels trapped or diminished or invisible. Helen squeezed her shoulder. You've built something extraordinary, Victoria, but you've also become someone extraordinary. The woman Derek married wouldn't have had the vision or courage for this, but the woman Derek's cruelty forged, she's changing the world. Victoria shook her head gently. Derek's cruelty didn't forge me, it revealed me, but it also revealed him. And in the end, that revelation set us both free. He's free to become whoever he needs to be, without me there to remind him of his worst self. And I'm free to be exactly who I am, without someone constantly telling me I'm not enough. The sun was setting over Manhattan, but the city's lights were beginning to twinkle to life. Thousands of individual illuminations creating a collective glow. Victoria thought about each light as a life, a story, a person navigating their own journey through darkness towards something better. I have one regret, Victoria said suddenly. Helen looked surprised. What's that? I wish I could go back and tell that 34-year-old woman in Thomas's study that it would all be worth it, but that the resources he was giving her weren't the real gift. The real gift was the permission to believe in herself, to trust her own judgment, to stop seeking validation from someone who was fundamentally incapable of providing it. I wish I could tell her that freedom was coming, and that it would be better than she could possibly imagine. Maybe that's why you do this work, Helen suggested. Every woman the foundation helps is that 34-year-old woman. But you're the future version coming back to say, it gets better. You're worth more than this. Your pain has purpose. Victoria nodded slowly, but a smile played at her lips. Maybe, but also I do this work because it's the only thing that makes sense. I have resources beyond what any person could spend in 10 lifetimes, but using them to build systems that create opportunities for people who've been dismissed or harmed. That's not charity. That's justice. That's taking power that was concentrated in the hands of people like Derek, people who inherited it without earning it and wielded it without wisdom, and redistributing it to people who understand its value because they know what it's like to live without it. They stood together in comfortable silence, but the moment felt significant, not an ending, but a recognition of how far the journey had already traveled and how much farther it would go. Victoria's phone buzzed again, but this time it was a reminder. Carmen's dinner tomorrow, 7 p.m. Bring stories, not gifts. Just yourself. Just yourself. But that was the gift Victoria had finally learned to give. Not the perfectly curated version she'd presented during her marriage, not the billionaire persona the media wanted to photograph, but simply herself. Flawed, scarred, still healing, but also powerful, purposeful, and present. She thought one final time about Derek, but the thought held no bitterness, no lingering anger, not even satisfaction at his downfall. He'd gotten exactly what he'd created, a life diminished by his own choices, friendships eroded by his own cruelty, a legacy of nothing but cautionary tale. But he'd also gotten something unexpected, a chance to rebuild, to learn, to become better. Whether he'd take that chance wasn't her concern anymore. Her concern was the young woman in that video and the thousands like her. But her concern was also Carmen and the 12,000 women who'd built businesses through the microfinance program. Her concern was every person who'd ever been told they were broken or worthless or beyond hope, and who needed to hear a different message. You are enough. You deserve support. Your survival matters, but your thriving matters even more. Ready to go? Helen asked. It's getting late, but I promised my kids I'd read them a story before bed. Victoria smiled, gathering her things. Go ahead, but I think I'll stay a bit longer. I want to respond to some of the comments on that video. Helen raised an eyebrow. You don't have to personally respond to everything, you know. That's what the community management team is for. I know, Victoria said, but I want to. These are real people with real stories. They deserve to know they've been heard. After Helen left, Victoria settled back into her chair and opened her laptop. But she spent the next 3 hours reading comments and responding personally to as many as she could manage. Each response was brief but genuine, acknowledging their pain and celebrating their resilience. But more than anything, she wanted them to know what she'd learned. That survival was valuable, but it wasn't the end goal. The end goal was a life fully lived on your own terms, in your own power. At midnight, she finally closed her laptop and stood, stretching tired muscles. But she felt energized rather than exhausted, purposeful rather than depleted. Tomorrow would bring Carmen's dinner, and next week a site visit to the new fertility treatment center, and next month testimony before Congress about domestic violence prevention funding. But all of it was work that mattered, work that used her resources and her voice and her experience to create space for others. As she left the building, the night security guard, a kind man named Marcus, who was putting himself through law school with the Foundation's Education Assistance Program, waved cheerfully. "Working late again, Mrs. Bennett?" "Always," she replied with a smile. "But it never feels like work when you love what you do." "My sister wanted me to thank you," Marcus said shyly. "She was in the housing program 2 years ago, but now she's got her teaching certificate and her own apartment. She says you changed her life." Victoria felt the now familiar tightness in her throat, but she'd learned to accept gratitude gracefully, to receive it without deflecting or diminishing it. "Your sister changed her own life, Marcus, but I'm honored to have been part of her journey. Make sure she knows how proud I am of her." Walking out into the Manhattan night, Victoria felt the city's energy pulsing around her, but she moved through it differently than she had 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. She moved with the confidence of someone who knew exactly who she was and what she was building, but she moved without arrogance, without the need to prove anything, without the weight of someone else's judgment pressing down on her shoulders. Derek had dumped his barren wife to marry a young model, unaware she was a multi-billionaire holding the family trust. But that story, sensational as it was, had never been the real story. The real story was about a woman who'd learned that her worth wasn't determined by her fertility, or her youth, or anyone's approval, but it was determined by how she used her resources, her voice, and her freedom to create possibilities for others. He had mocked her, unaware of her hidden real estate empire. But again, that wasn't the story. The story was that she'd built that empire not for revenge or validation, but because she understood that power wielded wisely could transform systems that kept people trapped. The surprising truth made him lose his mind, and what she did crushed him. But the deepest truth was that his reaction had been irrelevant to her purpose. She hadn't built the foundation to crush Derek, but she'd built it to lift up everyone he represented, everyone who'd been dismissed, diminished, or destroyed by systems that valued status over humanity. And in the end, that was the legacy that mattered. But it was also the life that mattered. One lived fully, freely, and in service to something larger than herself. Victoria hailed a cab, but as she settled into the back seat, she allowed herself one final thought about the journey that had brought her here. From dismissed wife to secret billionaire to public philanthropist. But the transformation had been internal before it was ever external. She'd learned to see herself clearly, to value herself appropriately, to wield power responsibly, and in doing so, she'd become exactly who Thomas Bennett had believed she could be, not despite Derek's cruelty, but through the strength she'd discovered while surviving it. The cab pulled away from the curb, carrying her home to her peaceful penthouse, where no one would mock her, diminish her, or make her feel less than whole. But more importantly, carrying her toward tomorrow and next week and next year, toward all the work still to be done, all the lives still to be touched, all the possibilities still to be created. She was 46 years old, permanently scarred by endometriosis and a marriage that had nearly broken her. But she was also more powerful, purposeful, and alive than she'd ever imagined possible. And that, Victoria thought as Manhattan's lights blurred past her window, was the real surprising truth. Not that she'd been secretly wealthy while Derek mocked her, but that she'd been secretly strong while he tried to break her, and in the end, strength had proven far more valuable than wealth, though having both, she admitted, with a small smile, certainly helped. The cab merged into traffic, but Victoria was already thinking about tomorrow's meeting, next week's initiative, next year's goals. The work never ended, but that was exactly how she wanted it, because this was her life now, lived on her terms, built with her values, and dedicated to ensuring that no one else had to suffer the way she'd suffered just to discover their own worth. And that was more than enough. That was everything.